Imagine for a moment the entirety, the sphere, the whole, in its uninterrupted, undifferentiated synergy and ecology. We have a state of grace. Now, in order to render that state of grace in human consciousness, it has to be filtered through language. Words are the pixels that provide the definition or resolution of a whole, of a synergy that cannot be captured in words. Now, as we take the entirety of a landscape, of a whole, of a synergy, where everything is inextricably connected on multiple dimensions, this pinky is linked to the farthest stars in the universe through the commonality of a universal law of gravity. The same atoms that are present in this pinky are present at the edge of the universe, admittedly arranged in a different pattern, but they are connected by habits in nature that underlie all structure, all matter. Now, if we were to take a 450 bits, kilobits, right? Image of a landscape, you would see the square digital grid overlaid on that landscape. You would see the blurred image as each pixel was only able to contain one color. Now, that blurred, pixelated image of a complex ecology viewed through a low-resolution digital camera is our human consciousness viewing the complexity of life, the complexity of the synergy of the ecology to which we belong and are a part. Those pixels are called words. Every thought is perceived through the lens of a metaphor called a word. And a word is boxing a particular area of reality and compartmentalizing it just like a pixel boxes in a rudimentary expression of a landscape and compartmentalizes it, and then reassembles all those pixels to say this is a representation. It's not real. It's not reality. It's a representation of reality. What we are conscious of through the lens, the pixelated lens of language, is not real. It is a dumbed down representation of reality. In the narrow dimensions that we have observing and measuring devices through which to glimpse, to perceive. Try and think a thought for a moment without words. Try and have a perception that you are conscious of without words. Speak that perception to yourself or another without words. We view reality through dim pixelated representations, symbols of reality called language, through which we experience thought, and it is to that, not reality, that we stimulate feelings and sensation. And it is out of those feelings, stimulated by that view, that we take action. We do not respond to reality directly because we lack the ability to perceive the complexity of the sphere without refracting it into little compartments called words. And they are compartments. We have this idea of nouns. A finger is a noun. But of course, it's not. It's not static. New atoms are constantly joining and leaving it. It doesn't exist in isolation. Sever the finger from the hand, and it ceases to function and be a finger. Sever the hand from the body, and it ceases to function and exist as a hand. Sever the body from the oxygen that gives it life, and it ceases to function as a body. Sever the planet from the law of gravity, and it ceases to behave like the planet we know. Without the law of gravity, the law or habit in nature that says that large objects in formation, large clusters of energy in dense formation, attract other particles, other clusters of energy to it. It's a habit. Wherever there are large masses, other masses move towards them. Without that habit, in the fractal pattern of physicality, would planets or large objects exist, or would every particle be spread out evenly across the multiverse in the endless field of space, with no pattern forming? Because the law of gravity, the habit of large objects attracting other objects, is no more. But the law of gravity doesn't exist in a vacuum. It requires particles and space through which to exhibit the habit. There is, in fact, nothing that is not inextricably linked to other things that are not inextricably linked to yet other things that do not, as these interconnections are realized through the consciousness of perception, to be an interconnected whole, however dull our version of that complexity is. Now, words break down things with a certain degree of arbitrariness. It's a bit arbitrary to say that this is water and this isn't, when the water emerged out of the cloud that we say is not water. It's a bit arbitrary to say that this is water and this is fire, when without the desalinization process coming from the sun, we would not have what we call potable water. When the sun heats up the ocean, and desalinizes the water in the form of clouds that run down in land. How can we say that you have fire and water as distinct objects when one creates the other, when one destroys the other? So fire creates water, certainly rain. The sun creates rain, and then rain puts out fire. How can you possibly talk about one without the other? When the individual emerges from the family, how can you talk about the individual without the family? When the father emerges from the grandfather, how can you talk about the father without the grandfather? When the people emerge from the country, it's been shown, for example, that the relationship with time is different in freezing climates than it is in temperate climates. When you have an area of land called New York, which every winter has 3 feet of snow, and you have an area of land called Thailand, which has never seen a single flake of snow in thousands of years, you have a different relationship to spontaneity. The person in New York who doesn't learn to interrupt sunbathing in the heat of July to go and gather wood dies in January and develops an interest out of fear in the future and a habit of discipline and countermanding instinctual feeling. Nobody feels like getting out a chainsaw in July. But those who do what they don't feel like doing survive January more successfully. And so future thought, planning, lineal logic is rewarded in New York but punished in Thailand. Because in Thailand, when you don't want to go and cut wood, you don't get up and cut wood. And when you don't get up and cut wood in Thailand, you don't freeze to death. You have a more relaxing time at the beach. A people emerge out of the planet and out of the weather pattern that is their home. And in different environments, different traits predispose one to sustainable well-being, more or less than another. When you have an abundance of tropical fruits, an abundance of fish, an abundance of warm weather, spontaneity and an enjoyment of the present is rewarded and blossoms. When you have harsh winters, forethought, preparation is rewarded, and a people are shaped. How can you talk about a people without the land from which they emerged? How can you talk about present thoughts without the historical thoughts that led to these thoughts today? How can you talk about a rebellion without acknowledging what was being rebelled against? How can you talk about a disease without examining the conditions that gave rise to it? How can you talk about someone who's running away through suicide, through physical terror, through disconnection and dissociation, without talking about the traumatic events from which they feel compelled to flee. There is no isolated object that is not in relationship to every other object. Directly, if we have the eyes to see it; indirectly, if we do not. So words are the pixels that represent a dumbed-down version of reality. And because there is a gap between 30 bits and a megabyte of reality. There's a gap between a 1 megabyte image and a terabyte of reality. That gap is tens of thousands of percent. And in that gap between the symbol, the metaphor, and the underlying reality lies friction, dishonor, pain, disrespect, to see and see again, respect, disrespect, violation, violence, and struggle. You see, when you understand and see 5 different identities, you can honor and respect and attune to each of these as separate things. The thumb is a little different. It's a little stronger than the pinky. And you can see that if you have the pixelation, the language to separate pinky and thumb. But there are other things, more nuanced. How can you interface with the atomic structure of any of these fingers without the ability to see atoms? And if what you see has already moved by the time you have time to think the thought, there it is, and now it's moved, because atoms are moving faster than the speed at which we articulate language and thus perceive our own thoughts. How can you connect and attune to something that is moving 1,000 times faster than you? How can you go on a walk with a friend who, by the time you say, "Would you like to go for a walk?" has walked 10,000 miles and is waiting for you to catch up, and by the time you take one step, has walked another 10,000 miles? How can you walk with and attune with something that is so out of scale? Well, we have a system of words that diverges wildly and widely from the underlying reality they represent. We have a system of thought that cannot reassemble the reality it breaks down through the lens of language with the same grace that it had before it was ruptured into the artificial lines we call words and meanings. And the paradigm that we construct through which to focus on some words more than others, it's incomplete. The paradigm of capitalism, the paradigm of communism, the paradigm of religion is incomplete, is faulty, because there is no religion without material survival through which to contemplate the language for the word religion. There is no faith without survival, without security, without some sense of love and belonging, without some sense of self-esteem. But these words pretend to exist in separate regions, distinct from one another, when in fact they are interlaced and cannot exist without the other. And what about culture? Culture. In the 10,000 cultures in human history, more than 9,000 of them are dead. When historically speaking, more than 90% of all cultures die or transform into something else that is so different from the past out of which it emerges that it is almost impossible to connect the two. When a 15th century Christian could not recognize a 20th century Christian, is there any overlap? Is there any thread that holds this word together? When 90% of cultures die because they fail to deliver an effective map with longevity that brings more grace than any other, what does it mean to attach and identify with a cult today that has a 99% chance of changing so much in 1,000 years as to be unrecognizable or to be dead? And what about family? The family, a fractal pattern of the culture, a fractal pattern of the intersection of language and weather and history and environment. And what about the individual ego? The ego emerging organically out of and in response to the environment of the family. And what about the roles? When you have a capitalist culture, it gives rise to roles, positions. Positions on the reconstructed sphere of cult. The role of banker, the role of debtor, the role of depositor, the role of debt collector, the role. We have an idea emerging out of a paradigm that defines positions. And what about the gap between who we are and these archetypal positions that we only partially fill? What about the fact that no individual fits snugly into their role? A pastor is not supposed to have sexual thoughts towards the people they are ministering to. The role of pastor is defined to be celibate. But the human being playing the role doesn't fit the definition. There's a gap between the underlying reality and the world. There's a gap between the way all the words reassemble the whole and the whole. There's a gap between the paradigm and the underlying reality. There's a gap between the cult and the underlying reality. There's a gap between who we are as a culture and the reality of our family. There's a gap between the image we project of our family. We are these types of people and we are not this people. And there's a gap between that statement and the people in the family. And there's a gap between the roles that we play and the people that we are. And there's a gap between the beliefs we say that we hold and the entirety of our action. And there's a gap between our identity and the deeper impulses that we have in relationship with ourselves and reality. And that gap, the gap at every single level of human consciousness, is the gap between the circle that is grace, between the synergy that is complete, and the geometry that has bumps. It's the gap between the circular wheel of life and the square tire we create to navigate it, which is one bump after another bump after another bump. Not because life is square, but because the rudimentary nature of the human observing and measuring device through the lens of the differentiated ego, looking back at the larger self of which it is a part, because that lens can only be shaped as finely as we have distinctions through which to observe and measure it, which can only be shaped as finely as we have language, which can only be shaped as finely as we have simultaneous consciousness through which to perceive complexity. If you can't remember 10 separate numbers reliably in sequence, 284, 630, 3,502, 1, 8, 97, 3, 29, 8, 2,542.5. If we cannot remember 10 numbers in sequence, our zoom-in focus is too narrow. What we see is too thin to hold the complexity of the totality of which we are a part. And in that thinness, we have the illusion of separation, which gives rise to the terror of isolation, the belief in our rejection and inadequacy, and the fear of a loneliness that is impossible, except when looking through the tunnel vision of paradigms and cult that emphasize some things more than others and recreate out of the abundance of the garden a hell of fractured mediocrity through the pixelated language of human thought. Our descent into the illusion of the individual allows the perception of the larger ecology of which we are a part from distinct and unique angles. Nature creates novelty, distinction, and uniqueness in great abundance. Human beings, every single one of them seeing the world a little different, billions of them, produced by nature. Billions of species, billions of atoms, billions of patterns, and billions of perspectives through which to see each of those in new ways. Nature is a novelty-generating program that has created a possibility field that is vast, through which to become one again with the sphere, but to see it from the outside as well as from the inside. Every system is flawed, and in that flaw there is a tension. The tension between the underlying reality and the symbol. And in that tension there is struggle. And in that struggle there is suffering. And in that struggle there is failure. The underlying reality does not conform to the complexity level, to the simplicity level of human consciousness. And human consciousness cannot conform to the complexity of that which is beyond its view, beyond its grasp. Our consciousness is a box, and that which exists outside the box is invisible to the consciousness that is the box. In this way, we cannot expand to the vastness of what is, and what is cannot dumb itself down to the simplicity of this box, and there is a tension as these two realities, the symbol of reality and the underlying reality, seek to engage in a way that is inherently dishonorable. Because how can you honor something that you do not see? How can you honor something that you do not understand? How can you love something that you do not know? We are forced to blunder into parts and faces of ourselves without understanding, because the complexity of the algorithm is beyond the limited scope of our point of view.